I love to hear all the conversation happening. Hopefully continues. Great. Okay. So we're moving from the institutional level to some frameworks for thinking about spiritual engagement in the arts. And so it is my delight to introduce our next two speakers. Taylor Worley is Visiting Associate Professor of Art History at Wheaton College and Director of a research project on art and transformation. Donato Loya is a postdoctoral researcher and instructor in art and religion at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Please join me in welcoming Taylor.
Let's see. I'll give it a try. Oh, it worked. This is better than my normal arrangement. It is so wonderful to be here. I'm so grateful to Emily and everyone who's organized this time. I'll just jump in. In his sentences on conceptual art, Saul LeWitt opens with this claim: conceptual artists are mystics rather than rationalists. They leap to conclusions that logic cannot reach. And while it may seem that the author was using a religious term for rhetorical effect, it should be noted that this statement actually begins his list of 35 discrete aphorisms on conceptual art. And at the same time, that biographers have noted LeWitt possessed and drew from several sources on Jewish mysticism in his personal library. More than 10 years later, Thomas Merton remarked in his bestseller, No Man is an Island, that art enables us to find ourselves and lose ourselves at the same time. Around the resonance of these seemingly parallel voices, this paper explores what kind of mystical thinking is inspired by conceptual art. And it will do so by bringing the unorthodox mechanics of experiencing conceptual art into conversation with the generative insights of contemplative thinkers and practitioners. Thus, a humble case will be made for even that difficult or challenging kind of work that we see in contemporary art as invitations to contemplative encounters of a deeply imaginative and potentially restorative kind. There are two aspects of conceptualism that enable it to foster mystical thinking. First, conceptualism represents a rehabilitating of iconoclastic sensibilities. Along these lines, Thomas Crow understands conceptualism to be, in essence, a strategy against visual idolatry. In No Idols, he traces out a pattern of anti-idolatrous sentiment emerging from within modernism itself, and he explicitly connects the impulse with the heyday of conceptual art. He writes, the idolatrous nature of cults surrounding quote-unquote true images is patent, but the transposition of religious value into aesthetic admiration likewise leaves the spectator in a posture of submission before a merely material object, preserving the fealty of the pre-literate image supplicant within the modern aesthete's self-exemption from supernaturalist credulity. Recoil from such tendencies in art across the board demonstrably motivated a good deal of conceptual art from the 1960s onward. Thus, what may appear as an irksome iconoclasm in contemporary art may just be the mysterious surface of something much more intriguing and generative. The second aspect of what fosters mystical thinking in conceptualism is its distinctively apophatic logic. Along these lines, the philosopher William Franke interprets the conceptual turn as part of what he sees as a larger, unmistakably apophatic impulse arresting modern culture more broadly. Franke offers the following account of apophasis's return. The idolatrous nature of cults, At historical moments of crisis, especially a crisis of language, insurgent skepticism, and the collapse of reigning paradigms of discourse, these shadowy traditions show up more prominently because the object of philosophy's contemplation, that is articulable reality, the logos of being, in its presumptive blinding splendor suddenly darkens. In these circumstances of tottering philosophical confidence, the undercurrents of apophasis resurface. They are now emerging again into the foreground as the unspeakable restlessly seized on all sides. In this way, apophasis presents itself as a defense against idolatry and the various forms it takes. Frankie continues, prior to any articulation of content, there is an affirmative belief in something that is as yet no thing, but that nevertheless proleptically orients all possible knowing and eventual speaking. This as yet unbroken, unarticulated, whole nothing that gathers all attention to itself in silence is more potent than any supervening articulation that breaks that silence. Thus, apophasis resurfaces time and again among mystics and theologians, artists and poets in a protective form, but also as an invitation to a fresh captivation with the world and a renewed pursuit of beauty through diverse contemplative means. So inasmuch as conceptualism presents an art that enables us to think about our own thinking, it does so in ways that parallel these logics and imitates these semantic shapes. Conceptualism seems like mystical thinking because its artistry prefers imaginative forms over material content. It remains open to many meanings rather than those imposed by the artist or other, and creates iterative rather than historical effects. So let's talk about how it works. Despite a seemingly anti-aesthetic or iconoclastic appearance, conceptual works resist simple identification with their visual surface and instead deploy an unorthodox mechanics for art appreciation. As a way to understand our reactions to modern and contemporary art, visual dissonance, Robert Salso's notion of visual dissonance informs us here. As he defines, a state of psychological tension caused when one experiences a disparity between what one expects to see and what one actually sees. And in the case of those unfulfilled expectations, the viewer then has to resolve his or her tension or simply abandon the piece and consider something else. Salso notes that the technique of producing unexpected visual forms is widely practiced by modern artists. And he sees them as seeking to gain our attention and further the intellectual effort required for appreciation. 3 potential strategies emerge here for alleviating that visual dissonance. The first, reduction. The second, revision. And the third, interesting for our purposes, reinterpretation. Reinterpretation is thus the operative category here. And such cognitive exercises seem to be precisely what conceptual artists intend with their works. Thus, the confusion that viewers typically experience when encountering works of conceptual art is then just the beginning of a more complex or more extended cognitive process. A process that might involve confusion, firstly, and integration next, followed by production. I'll explain. First, confusion is that initial zone of visual dissonance wherein a viewer encounters a seemingly non-art object within the art viewing context or space of other obvious art objects and is faced with a perceptual dilemma. Such encounters can be particularly unsettling or off-putting. At this point, though, viewers must determine whether they wish to attempt a mental reconciliation of the seemingly out of place or anti-aesthetic display. In other words, participants must be willing to entertain the possibility that what they understand to be art can include the confusing thing they've just encountered. If they choose, the viewer then progresses to the next phase of integration. For this stage, the viewer must navigate the back and forth reasoning necessary to balance the artwork's challenge of artistic consistency. For example, I've seen seemingly non-art objects in museums before. Some ready-mades here, some other seemingly non-art objects. Balancing, like, I'm a little bit familiar with this, with artistic innovation. Like, there's something about this that's entirely new or different. Such engagement continues to draw upon visual perception, but also deals with a good deal of memory work and a lot of fresh reasoning, even speculation based on the context clues in the space. While such cognitive effort may involve lots of heavy lifting, this perspective is not the finish line of the experience, but the setting the stage for something bigger and better. Once the level of dissonance has been resolved, viewers progress to the most advanced phase, the phase of production. This is the zone of reward, where the hard work of holding the aesthetic tension of the encounter and working to integrate the experience pays off in some way. Here, the cognitive resonance of the artwork within the imagination of the viewer is what really matters. The imaginative confidence earned by that mental journey can now be utilized to engage in fresh forms of meaning making. The traditional categories of correct or incorrect assessment, or even refined or less refined taste, are kind of thrown out the window for what sort of creative new associations or imaginative extensions might be made with this work. It's kind of the opposite of the taking of the selfie, right? Within the Racklin Murphy's own collection, such examples can be discovered and even seen on view. I was surprised to find a John Baldessari in the collection, not on view, but part of the collection. Another example would be the Andy Goldsworthy that is on view downstairs, the Yinka Shonobari that's already been referenced, or the recent acquisition of the Swain Hahn Ash Banquet number 4. We see these perhaps unorthodox mechanics at work as soon as we step in the door, maybe even before we step in the door. I was surprised to find the Jenny Holzer piece on the facade of the building, these two quotations. So inasmuch as conceptual art provides for a decidedly non-immersive, maybe emotionally mere experience, the kind of thing where you have to renew this imaginative contract over and over again, this thing that I'm looking at, I want to see it as art. That's difficult. It's kind of like what we heard about last night, the confrontation with art, or what we heard already this morning from Siddhartha. There's a quandary. How do I be in front of this seemingly non-art object? So finally, we come to the question of contemplation. More specifically, what does the Christian tradition of contemplation offer us? That is, a tradition that confesses belief in, quote, all things visible and invisible. Again, Merton, art is not an end in and of itself. It makes us alive to the tremendous mystery of being in which we ourselves, together with all other living and existing things, come forth from the depths of God and return again to him. Like Merton, the philosopher Kevin Hart also recognizes the value of contemplation with art today. In his Contemplation and Kingdom, Hart takes up the question of expanding the approved thresholds for contemplation. Returning to Richard of St. Victor's The Mystical Art, he concludes, so according to Richard, everything in reality, whether created or uncreated, offers itself to human contemplation as well as to meditation and thought. There is nothing so small or banal that it does not respond to a free, attentive gaze that has been educated in the faith and that begins directing us towards spiritual levels of being. In other words, for the clean, all things are clean. And when it comes to contemplation, Hart writes, the aesthetic and the religious are not always so easily separate. So we may then assume that the arts, even the most contemporary and experimental of them, may avoid exclusion as well. Moreover, the use of Richard here is indeed illuminating. Hart clarifies, Richard posits a hierarchy of thinking, meditating, and contemplating. Yet in another wider sense, there is nothing excluded from contemplation. No change of object is required, only a shift in attitude. Here is how Richard himself articulates that change in his text. In thinking, there is wandering, in meditation, investigation, in contemplation, wonder. It seems to me that the contemporary teachers and practitioners of this tradition, for example, the practice of centering prayer, maintain these aspirations, these very aspirations. And Father Thomas Keating is representative in his call to rest in a silent place beyond thinking. So while it is no substitute for Christian practices of contemplation, the experience of conceptual art can offer an aesthetic model for such experiences that affirms our human capacity for wonder and perhaps leads to deeper stores of spiritual contemplation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Emily, for organizing this. I'll start with the disclaimer. This is a bit of an irresponsible paper, and the reason is that there are many kinds of museums, the Encyclopedic Museum, the University Gallery, the Art Museum, and there are different conceptions of what is sacred and different religious traditions. I will try to speak of the museum and of the sacred in general, accepting the risk of generalization. The questions that I asked myself are the following. What happens to the sacred when it enters the museum? What happens when an object that once belonged to ritual, to devotion, to a lived religious tradition is placed inside a museum? I'm not trying to say that by the end of this talk you will be able to respond to these questions, of course. What I'm trying to say is that I'm trying to reflect. This is my attempt. Let's say this is my essay, meaning my attempt in trying to reflecting. Let me approach this question, first of all, historically, just with one event. 1754, the King of Saxony acquired Raphael's Sistine Madonna for the museum in Dresden. Still until the 19th century, we have accounts that this image is considered a miraculous image. So I'm not trying to make a distinction between a devotional object and art objects in a too linear way. History is messy. There is no such thing as linearity in history. At the same time, from that moment on, viewers could consider this object, a devotional object, primarily as a work of art. As Hans Belting observed, in the museum, the priest becomes Raphael. The Romantics start noticing the emergence of a new devotion, the devotion to art itself. What does it mean? It means that in this framework, subject matter does not disappear, it cannot disappear, but it tends to recede. It becomes in some way also a backdrop against which artistic mastery, style is displayed. Still to this day, when visitors stand before Raphael, what they often see, of course not always, is not the theological event, but the artist. As Sally Promi reminds us, museums facilitated the process by which Catholic devotional objects, not to mention other sorts of idols from the Christian missions field, might be drained of their natural and supernatural agencies and enchantments, and once purified, resituated for modern contemplation and aesthetic inspiration. In the literature on religion in museums, this is a point that we find over and over again. The museum transforms the object. The museum is not neutral. The museum does not simply preserve objects. And I think that as much as we want to make room, and as we should, for religion and spirituality in museums, it is good to keep this aspect on the back of our mind. I've always loved this photo by Elliot Erwitt. I'm going to use it here metaphorically to offer a more general reflection on museums and to bring to a close this first part of my presentation. It is an image that suggests that museum intervenes in the ontological substance of objects. As soon as an object enters a museum, the thingness, its materiality, comes to the fore. Of course, a painting, this is something that you can say about any object, can still be perceived as a revelation, as a spiritual threshold. This image itself, with its own emphasis on materiality, does not exclude the possibility of transcendence. The window reflected in the glass of one of the paintings reminds us that an artwork can always be more than itself. If we remember the talk from yesterday night, it is always a matter also of the kind of attention that we decide to give to reality. And yet at the same time, this photograph suggests that in the museum, art also becomes a realm unto itself, independent from theological, cosmological frameworks. It becomes information, knowledge, matter in many ways. And yet, the possibility of encountering the work as sacred is not erased entirely by the museum. It is rendered more uncertain. This is my argument in this paper. So I could also finish here, but I'll continue to speak for 10 more minutes to try to... What do I mean? The sacred does not disappear. That will be too simple and false. What happens instead is something more subtle. The museum introduces a distance, a gap. I'm not going to read this entire citation from Alasdair MacIntyre, who I'm sure people here at Notre Dame might be familiar with his work, and of course not exclusively, but I'm going to summarize it for you, because in some ways very close to the argument that I'm trying to make. It is impossible to fully detach Bach's music from the Christian tradition. And yet, once it enters the concert hall, or let's say YouTube, for example, it becomes, in a sense, a representation of a prayer, a representation of a vision of God. Like the concert hall, MacIntyre here is speaking of a concert hall, the museum introduces a gap, introduces a break, a distance, it marks a gap. Bach's St. Matthew Passion resists any complete separation of the sacred from the secular, and this is something that you can say about so many artworks in our museums. It will be too strong to say that the link between the sacred and the art disappears entirely, but something has been broken, a traditional link has been lost, even in some measure for those who still count themselves believers. It is not my fault, obviously. The museum is a testing ground for the sacred because it introduces this gap. To put it in a formula, sacred art becomes religious art. Sacred art becomes religious art. I'm going slightly beyond MacIntyre here, and I'm using the citation before as an inspiration. What I'm trying to communicate is something paradoxical, no, maybe contradictory is the better term to use. We witness something in a museum, something that we might say persistence of the sacred, but also transformation of the sacred into religious art, and also the emergence of other forms of sacrality, something that we might call the diaspora of the sacred. And I don't have too much time to enter into this theme, but what do I mean? Is that the museum, not exclusively, also art history, also the art market, have contributed to the creation of the cult of the artist, the autonomy of aesthetic experience, the authority of art history. And you might be wondering, but what art history has to do with the sacred? Also, art history has its own form of sacredness. Knowledge is sacred for art history. In the museum, different ontologies, different relations to the sacred, different ideas of what is sacred are brought into proximity. So what emerges is a tension between erasure, persistence, and transformation. So I want to discuss a couple of examples that I have in mind here that address this tension that I think exists between erasure, persistence, and transformation of the sacred within a museum. These examples also concern encounters and spiritual engagement with art objects, as you will see. I didn't bring my coffee or some water here with me. Okay, no, just, sorry, I realized that. The first example is Cherry Samba's A Tribute to Earlier Artists. In this first painting, the artists present. Thank you so much. So the first example is this work by Cherry Samba entitled A Tribute to Earlier Artists. So in this painting, the artist presents himself behind a wooden table upon which there is a selection of traditional African art objects. The texts on the side that I don't know if you cannot see too clearly, but I'm going to summarize them for you. They narrates his visit to a collection in Zurich, in Switzerland, where he says that he sensed supernatural power emanating from these works. He does not use the word sacred, but he talks in terms of the supernatural power that these objects still retain. Actually, he says something that is persuaded that this something comes from them, as if, and I'm citing him here, their original force might still be there. And I always found this hesitation crucial in this painting, in the as if their original force might still be there. Because in some way, it signals a change. This is sacred becomes, this feels sacred to me, or this has supernatural power becomes, I feel this has supernatural power to me. Of course, how do you explain this transition? You can explain it in a number of ways. You could say that with regard to this work, for example, there has been a trauma that happened in relation to these traditional African objects, the trauma of colonialism that also Cherry Samba mentions, not directly, but speaking about Monsieur Corré, a collector in Zurich who never visited Africa, but he accumulated this collection of African objects. At the same time, apart from this post-colonial critique that one could make, post-colonial argument that one could make, the painting also acknowledges attention, which is the aspect that interests me the most. There is an uncertain persistence of the sacred, of what Samba calls supernatural power. Uncertain because we do not know where to locate this power, in the objects themselves or in the personal response of the artist, who seeks to persuade us that they still have power. At the same time, the reason why I also I decided to show you this painting is because it's a painting that acknowledges one of the tensions that I'm trying to articulate here, the creation also of the cult of the artist. The artist, who at this time is already an incredibly successful contemporary artist, is framing himself as part of this painting also with an element of narcissism. I mean, we are, as a way of saying, I am also an artwork in some way. I'm expected to be collected and to be part of museums as these traditional African objects. I'm part of this grand lineage of makers. So there is all this tension here that exists in this painting between transformation of the sacred, creation of new forms of sacrality, the cult of the artists. I mean, also the cult of academics. Also, academics want to be loved. I mean, this is a feature, not exclusively. I don't want to give you the impression that I'm criticizing exclusively artists. There is much to say about us, not necessarily good things. And the second and final example that I want to mention is this one. In the Mojave Desert, just outside the California city, hundreds, sometimes thousands of men, women, and children gather to follow Maria Paula Acuna, who sees and speaks with the Virgin Mary. The crowd assembles to watch the visionary at the place known as Our Lady of the Rock. At some point during the procession, Maria Paula Acuna claims to see and hear the Virgin Mary, while witnesses capture evidence of the Virgin's presence by taking photographs of the sky. Lisa Bittel, who has written a beautiful book on these apparitions, notes that with the popularization of Polaroid and digital cameras, witnesses to apparitions found the perfect technology for making what they believed to be tamper-proof evidence for the presence of the invisible. The sacred does not disappear from our time, and even the most inexpensive photograph, digital camera, the most ordinary digital image, can be remained charged with aura. And yet, a question remains. What happens if these images, not these images that I'm showing, I'm thinking about the actual Polaroids, for example, enter a museum? Do they become automatically documents of belief, historical evidence? What remains of their auratic quality once they are resituated within a museum? I notice maybe this is a trend throughout this program. I'm also going to end with questions. I won't end with answers. Started my presentation with questions, and I'm finishing my presentation with questions. For I do not have answers, but mostly doubts about this incredibly complicated subject that we're here discussing today. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Donato and Taylor. We have some time for questions. Anybody has a question? Eva?
Thank you both so much. I was really struck by a phrase you used, the persistence of the sacred in objects in a museum. I'm wondering, speak a little bit more about that, or ideas maybe around how we honor the persistence of the sacred.
Yes. It's a simple question. How do you honor the persistence of the sacred in museums? I have to say, I didn't reply or provide a definition of the category of what is sacred. You might have noticed in this essay, in this presentation, because I would have found it. Can you all hear me if I speak like this? The sound of the voice in the microphone alienates me. I didn't provide the definition of sacred. I don't think that sacred art can be reduced to ecclesiastical art or to liturgical art. And of course, sacred art cannot be reduced to one religious tradition, let's say Christianity or Islam or Buddhism. All true art is sacred when it tells us something about humanity in its fullness. It will be absurd for the art historian or for the curator or for the artist to tell you this is humanity in its fullness. But it is the responsibility, an ethical responsibility of the viewer and also the curator, of the artist, to hint, to direct you towards the mysteries of birth and joy and how to reconcile faith and knowledge. But this is what is refreshing about sacred art, because humanity is not reduced to one factor. I didn't reply to your question, but yeah.
We'll do Mary Lou in the back.
Yeah, this question is for Taylor. Taylor, you quoted a citation from a book by Kevin Hart called Contemplation and Kingdom.
Yeah.
And there is a key question in that book, and you mentioned that. Does the contemplation include the kingdom as well as the king? And I want to hear your reflection on that. Thank you.
I appreciate the question because I think it kind of follows on from the question Donato was just attempting to answer, which I'm glad you got that question, not me. Just to say I think what I found like really helpful there in Kevin Hart's approach was something that I was kind of sensing as I was reading, Theologies of Contemplation in the Christian tradition, and just getting the sense that there's such givenness to the world as we experience it, that it may not be ticking a box of qualities in the artwork itself, but it may be the attentive, inquisitive, or curious engagement that we bring to it. I feel like that's just as reckless of an approach as the opposite. But that's kind of where I'm at, and that's where I'm like finding Hart's work helpful. Yeah.
Mike?
So I'm just curious what you specifically like about the Baldessari and how you apply it with your talk today. And both of you, what do you enjoy about Baldessari?
I mean, I think I would say the playfulness of Baldessari to begin with. I mean, California conceptualism is its own brand. It's certainly not as grumpy or philosophical as other schools of thought. That I enjoy those as well. But yeah, the Baldessari. I mean, so the opening, the title slide was a Baldessari work as well. That was just instructions that he gave to students. And I can't remember the location of where those art students were right now, but that idea of taking something very, if I had more time, I would have delved into an example from Felix Gonzalez Torres, but I really like how he embodies the best of, it's not really a tradition, but the best conceptualism as an art-making strategy, the best of that I think Baldessari is a pioneer in. Gonzalez Torres talked about fragile forms, very temporary, fragile forms of art in terms of their materiality, but indestructible ideas. So that combination of a very fragile, temporary thing to encounter in a museum or gallery space, that because of the artist's creativity is connected to an indestructible or like a timeless idea or story. I find that like just a really generative approach, and we live in a world of immense distraction, and we need technologies, new technologies, maybe very ancient technologies for retraining ourselves in the power of attention. I'm going to stop talking. I'm talking too much. Yeah.
No. I
Please,
just add
yeah.
something very briefly about the question on Baldassare and in general about the examples that you discussed, Taylor. And I really appreciated the idea of trying to make room also within an art form like conceptual art for theological interpretation, theological reading. At the same time, which is something that some way I would also be curious to hear more of your thoughts, but it's hard to reconcile a certain element of ambiguity that material art also has. Christian art is not afraid of having pedagogical scopes. It tells you something about how to live. Conceptual art, and I'm using this category to think about so much contemporary art, seems to be very much incapable to move beyond the questions of ambiguity of doubt. Now, I myself have a tendency to appreciate that kind of art. In many ways, probably because doubt is very much part embedded in the structure of the modern condition. And yet, at the same time, it is always not easy to reconcile conceptual art, contemporary art, with theological readings. And this is something that maybe it is still a kind of work that I believe the people who are working in this field, we do still need to figure out how to find the better words to speak about these two aspects.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you to our two panelists today.